I think one of the issues on the nuclear side is that we're into new generations of people who have no real knowledge of how dangerous it was and what nuclear weapons could do. If I'm talking to students who are maybe 18, 19 or even early 20s, they were not even born when the Cold War ended. And essentially the knowledge of the dangers is frankly not there. I sometimes say, you know, what would happen if a 1 megaton bomb had been dropped on Bradford? Bradford would have disappeared. 200,000 plus people would have been killed. And that would have had an impact for many years to come. The British government believed that if Britain was involved in a nuclear war, 40 million people out of the population, 56 million would have died. People don't know this. It's a new history for anybody really under the age of about 40. We were really right on the edge of potential disaster. People talk about nuclear weapons keeping the peace and that there was stability. That's way away from what was really happening. Essentially, there were periods when things were on almost hair-trigger alerts. There were accidents. Nuclear weapons have been lost at sea and never recovered. There have been false alarms. There have been misperceptions. The Cuba Missile Crisis was the most famous one. At one point, the United States was prepared to consider invading Cuba, not knowing at the time that the Soviets already had tactical army nuclear weapons within Cuba, and they probably would have used them. So there are many examples through the Cold War era where things were really very dangerous and they were really very close to being near misses. It's a history which is largely forgotten, but it's a very important one because people were prepared on both sides to entertain the idea of using nuclear weapons on a huge scale. And it's something which has subsided to some extent in history, but was very powerful at the time. Some of the largest nuclear weapons of the Cold War era were 2,000 times as powerful as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And there were a lot of them. And overall, there were over 60,000 nuclear weapons at the peak in the 1980s. And the extraordinary thing is that people did not fully recognize just how incredibly damaging they would be. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki had showed that. It was almost as we forgot that and were locked into this idea that nuclear weapons kept the peace. And that, I think, was the real danger. One of the developments, a positive development of the last 8 or 10 years, is the way in which some people who were right in the middle of that now adopt a much more critical stance of the whole nuclear field. It happened earlier on with Robert McNamara, the Kennedy's defense secretary, and sort of 10 or 15 years ago, he was convinced it was much more important to move towards a nuclear-free world. But in the relatively recent past, some of the major figures like Sam Nunn and Henry Kissinger, and some people in the British side as well, now take this view that we've got to seriously look at the possibility of a nuclear-free world. That is a major change, and it is there whatever happens. It's, in a sense, almost the blinkers are coming away from the eyes of a number of people who were convinced it was the only way forward 30 years ago, are now very unsure that this is the way forward for the future. If we are looking at future circumstances which might catalyse rapid change, they come in two forms. One is positive, one is negative. The positive one, for example, would be a British government elected in maybe 3 years' time of a political nature which was prepared to see Britain maintain nuclear weapons but at a very much lower level. In other words, cut right back to what they claim would be a minimum deterrent. Maybe a quarter of what Britain has now, which is relatively small compared to the Cold War. That would be a major step forward, particularly if they were saying that this might even not be permanent. So you would have one of the 5 major nuclear states actually saying, we are really seriously starting to move away. So that would be a positive development. On the negative side, well, frankly, some sort of crisis or an accident, some kind of major accident involving a nuclear weapon, and that could be in Russia, the United States, or elsewhere. Including perhaps some sort of release of radioactivity, not necessarily a nuclear blast. Or some sort of crisis possibly involving India and Pakistan, which might come very near the brink, or certainly one would have to say the Middle East. And there, the possibility would be that the Israelis decide to strike against Iran. The Iranians respond not in a military way, but immediately by withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and saying that however they do it, they are now going to develop nuclear weapons because they have to keep themselves secure. It's that kind of thing which would really make people rethink the need to actually go much more rapidly to a nuclear disarmed world. But in the latter case, an accident or a crisis in South Asia or the Middle East, we would be dealing with dangerous times and very unpredictable times. And I think to some extent it's the unpredictability of possible events which might actually shake people up.